Gore in Battlefield. Could it happen? Should it happen? And if it was to happen, would it detract away from the key gameplay experience in favour of looking cool? Or would it instead add something completely new and refreshing to the game to make it a better thing? These are the sort of topics I'm going to be exploring in this video, and it's not really aimed at Battlefield 5 or any particular game in the franchise, but the franchise itself, edging forwards into the unknown depths of the future. So gore, dismemberment and jibbing is something that's been around in games for as long as I can remember. In case you're wondering what I'm on about here, it's basically where in certain games you can use some sort of powerful weapon or gun, point said gun at some guy's head, squeeze the trigger, and then watch that head pretty much disappear in a cloud of ketchup and chicken nuggets. Gore is the nasty looking wounds you inflict on bad guys when you shoot them, punching chunks of flesh from their virtual bodies and basically creating lots of red pixels. Dismemberment being the ability to cause limbs to fly off in a dramatic and often satisfying manner, you know, one of the things that made the Dead Space series so appealing. And jibbing being a term coined from the word giblets, so the offal of a dead animal, essentially causing biomatter, such as a poor human being, to pretty much be obliterated and transformed into a shower of mushy blobs and pieces, like an exploding bargain bucket from KFC. These are the sort of things we've seen in countless other games, but never Battlefield. There's a ridiculous amount of old and new examples of these gore mechanics being used in video games, from the very first Doom dating back to 1993 to the likes of Resident Evil. And it's not just limited to the horror category either, as there's lots of fairly modern games, including some big first-person shooters, that fully embrace the power of brutal weapon damage too, like Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, Insurgency: Sandstorm, and even some of the Call of Duty games. Let's not forget about all the gore and nasty scenes from some of our favourite war movies too, like Saving Private Ryan and Black Hawk Down. They had a pretty big impact on the audience, added a further sense of realism, and showcased the strength and devastation of certain weapons and explosives. Battlefield being a war game at heart with a lot of similar themes, and being marketed for older audiences, often with an M rating designed to be played by people over the age of 18, you'd think the devs would be pretty eager to dip their toes into this idea, and essentially make it possible to replicate some of those brutal scenes from war movies, or even just to add a new layer of immersion and realism. So when a 50 caliber bullet slaps you in the face, perhaps that face shouldn't be there anymore. The Battlefield games have had plenty of blood and curse words thrown into the mix to sort of justify its adult rating, but when it comes down to gore and dismemberment, that's always been left on the shelf for a rainy day. Probably for a few good reasons. One of the big things that's quite obviously deterred DICE from toying around with the whole gore idea is the fact that you can run around as a medic, shove a needle into some dead guy's arm, and watch that guy pop up like a fresh daisy to have a second attempt at life. If his arm got ripped off by an explosive, then a medic's not exactly going to be able to come along and sew the bugger back on, like nothing ever happened. I know being revived with a needle seems a bit daft from a realistic standpoint, but sticking limbs back on bodies is pushing it a bit too far. The revive mechanic is a major part of the Battlefield games, and it's something that I'm 99.9% certain will never go away, as it'd pretty much destroy an entire class and make a hell of a lot of people very, very angry. Battlefield's revive system is one of the things that's not only been in the game from the beginning, but it's also something that separates the game from a lot of other multiplayer shooters on the market too. It makes squad play and team focused gameplay much more compelling and important, and if you sacrificed all of that in favour of having some bloody stumps and a few bits of flying meat, then I'm pretty certain the franchise would be transformed into a totally different thing. Not exactly what the fans want at the end of the day. One of the big questions here is, could Gore ever work in tandem with Battlefield's revive system, without completely destroying it and making the medic class totally useless? Well, I guess that depends on how cleverly it was snuck in there, and how often said Gore system kicked in. Obviously, the devs would be a bit crazy to go down the Fallout route, where a lot of generic weapons are capable of blasting off arms and legs in a spectacular but unrealistic fashion. Taking someone's head off with a pistol in Battlefield would just seem a bit stupid. So it'd make complete sense to reserve the gory moments for times when they really should happen. Often times that would make sense to make a player unrevivable too, like when you take a tank shell to the chest or if a grenade detonates right underneath your feet. Perhaps some of these things could put players in an unrevivable state, like the melee and bayonet system in Battlefield 1, and like the way it worked in Battlefield Hardline, not being able to revive someone who's been shot in the head. I suppose because there's more emphasis on reviving than ever now in Battlefield 5, due to the fact that pretty much everyone has the ability to bring people back from the dead, whether it be a medic or squad member, this idea of having more unrevivable kills from certain things might not be such a crazy idea after all. Normal bullet-based weapons like assault rifles and SMGs should still play out in a normal way, and it'd be best if the majority of deaths, including splash damage from explosives and stuff like that, were all pretty much the same too, revivable by a medic. But perhaps if you were to use a certain weapon type with a more powerful round, then that could add a whole new dynamic to the game, and even allow you to change your tactics depending on the situation. Kinda like how LMGs have superior material penetration, but giving them the added perk of being able to dismember limbs and cause critical damage. This could play into the whole rock paper scissors style of gameplay that Battlefield's entire system is built upon, potentially giving certain classes with their specific heavy weapons a hard counter against medics, when a lot of players on the other team are rushing forwards, banging smoke everywhere, and reviving all the dead carcasses you've just successfully mowed down. Obviously everything would need to be well balanced, but it could be an interesting idea. Gory kills could not only add something different from a visual perspective, but they could also technically alter the core gameplay, in a way that, done properly, could add to the game rather than take from it. Just so long as it wasn't a complete and utter bloodbath, and gore was limited to certain weapons, deaths and points of contact. Another idea that had allowed DICE to add gore without limiting the existing revive system in any way, shape or form could be that if a player has already been revived, and they're killed by a powerful weapon the second time during a single life, then that might trigger a gory kill and make them unrevivable. It wouldn't take anything away from the medic's ability to revive, as that player has already come back from the dead once before, and has been given a second chance to try and stay alive. But if that poor bastard gets hit by an RPG or steps on a mine, then it's game over for them, finishing that player off in a much more satisfying way. But I know for a fact that this would still divide a lot of the fanbase, because it sorta goes away from Battlefield's traditional non-gore image, reflecting the much grittier, more brutal side of war that hasn't really been portrayed in the series so far. With that said, the more recent Battlefield games have shown off this darker side of warfare a bit more so than in the past. Battlefield 1 definitely stepped closer to being a much grittier shooter, with some pretty gnarly melee executions with barbaric, shoddily made clubs, brutal trench combat, flamethrowers, and just generally harsher vibes that we've not really seen in the Battlefield games before it. And this really helped to highlight the horrors of the First World War, and the savageness of the weapons used in it. Battlefield 5 on the other hand might have taken a light approach in its overall style. Things all seem to look a bit brighter, more vibrant and a bit happier in a weird way. But there's still loads of blood being splashed around and spilt all over the place, with blood effects being much improved over the games before it, not only appearing underneath your down victim in the form of shiny red pools, but covering their clothes and staining their hands and weapons too, giving the game a few extra brownie points for realism and detail. It's safe to say that the last couple of Battlefield games, especially Battlefield 1, have taken a step slightly further away from the light-hearted theme from the modern base games, into darker territory. Maybe because they were based on world wars and real events, so the mood would obviously have to reflect those darker times in history. But this goes to prove that those grittier combat experiences can be successful in the Battlefield franchise, without totally defacing the game's original identity and turning it into something else. A lot of people praise Battlefield 1 for embracing the true horrors of the Great War, instead of turning it into something silly. Battlefield games have never meant to be taken too seriously, but DICE has always tried to design a game that creates a sense of immersion and realism at the forefront, which can still have unrealistic gameplay elements thrown into it, for the sake of gameplay and fun. It's a bit hard to find a good balance of realism and fun, but Battlefield 5 is a pretty good example, having loads of realistic details, yet still not playing out like some sort of real-life simulation, which would be pretty boring for the game. The fact that DICE have used darker themes recently and are still striving to create immersive games that are fun, could this be the time for them to start thinking about the possibility of adding gore and dismemberment into the series, or would that still be a step too far? I couldn't exactly imagine it being a bad thing if it somehow didn't limit the revive system, and I'm sure it could even add something to the series, if gore was implemented in a way that didn't detract away from the main gameplay tropes. So basically, if arms and legs weren't constantly flinging around all over the place like some sort of horror show. Some games like Call of Duty even have graphic content filters in their settings, so you can turn off the gory violence and blood if you're a bit of a pansy who gets offended by it. So if Battlefield was to ever go down the same route, perhaps a similar filter could be added to that too. There's no telling whether Battlefield will ever travel down that route, and there's no telling whether it'd improve the game in any way or make it worse. I guess it'd be a tricky thing for the devs to figure out, especially with all the soldier customization and different uniforms, complicating textures and animations. It'd be a bit of a riddle for DICE to solve, but if they're striving to create the most immersive, satisfying experience possible, where players are indeed made of flesh, muscle and blood, instead of being ragdoll mannequins, then a gore system could potentially be created for a game sometime in Battlefield's future. So what are your opinions on Battlefield having a possible gore system implemented further down the line? I can pretty much guarantee that there won't be anything like this coming to Battlefield 5, as that game's mechanics are already set in stone, and a system like this would take too much dev time to create, to simply patch into an already existing game. Not to mention that DICE are already stupidly busy trying to make maps, modes and weapons to release through Tides of War for Battlefield 5. But there's no reason why we couldn't see gore come along at a later date for another game. Would you like to see more gory, brutal kills in Battlefield, or do you reckon it should stay a gore-free zone? I'd love to hear your points of view on this topic, so let me know what you think about all of this down below in the comments. Subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay updated with all the new content coming soon, and of course, thanks for watching. Take it easy folks, and I'll be seeing you in that next episode.